On a tense September morning in Jerusalem, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu launched one of his most pointed attacks against Qatar. Speaking with unusual directness, he accused the Gulf state of being more than a mediator in the long war between Israel and Hamas. He accused it of being a funder, a protector, and a shield for Hamas leaders. For Netanyahu, the blame for Hamas's survival went beyond Gaza's tunnels and weapons. It reached the corridors of Doha. Netanyahu's words were sharp and deliberate. He declared, if Qatar had wanted to, it would have exerted much stronger pressure. That would have helped us release all those detained since the first months of the war. It is linked to Hamas, it supports it, it houses it, it finances it. It has much stronger tools of pressure, much greater influence, but it chose not to use them. In those lines, Netanyahu turned the spotlight onto one of Washington's closest Gulf allies, painting Qatar not as a neutral broker, but as a state complicit in prolonging the conflict. This statement did not come in isolation. Just hours before, Israel had struck in Doha itself, targeting Hamas officials meeting inside the Qatari capital. For the first time in history, Israeli firepower extended into Qatar's heart, piercing the assumption that the Gulf monarchy was beyond the battlefield. For many, it was a breathtaking escalation. Israel had often struck Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria, but Doha, host to US forces and central to Middle Eastern diplomacy, was something altogether different. For years, Qatar's balancing act was tolerated, even encouraged. It hosted Hamas leaders in exile, providing them offices and residences. At the same time, it poured billions into Gaza for reconstruction and humanitarian aid, money that often kept the enclave afloat. In Washington, this arrangement was seen as useful. Qatar could play the role of go-between, carrying messages between Hamas, Israel, and the United States. But to Netanyahu, that very role became an indictment. By housing Hamas and funding projects that he claimed strengthened its grip, Qatar was not a mediator. It was, in his eyes, a sponsor. The timing of Netanyahu's accusation could not be overlooked. Israel's war with Hamas, raging since the earliest months of 2024, had entered a grinding, brutal stage. Thousands of lives were lost, ceasefires collapsed, and the humanitarian situation in Gaza worsened by the day. International pressure on Israel mounted, with protests sweeping capitals from London to Washington. By pointing to Qatar, Netanyahu aimed to shift part of the burden outward, reframing the narrative that Israel was not alone responsible for the prolongation of violence, that a Gulf state was enabling it. Diplomats across the region reacted with alarm. In the Arab world, the strike on Doha was described as a violation of sovereignty, a dangerous precedent, and a message to all states hosting groups Israel considered hostile. The United Nations warned of an even wider destabilization, urging Israel to restrain itself and calling for dialogue. Yet Netanyahu's words had already struck a chord. They were designed not just for the Middle East, but for Washington itself. By accusing Qatar of having the power but refusing to use it, he was in effect challenging America's reliance on Doha as a mediator. Qatar's response was swift and furious. Officials in Doha condemned the Israeli strike as a breach of international law and branded it an act of aggression. They reminded the world that Qatar had repeatedly played host to delicate ceasefire talks, prisoner exchanges, and humanitarian negotiations. Without Doha, they argued, such fragile diplomacy would collapse altogether. The attack and the accusation, they said, undermined the very possibility of dialogue. But Netanyahu was not backing down. His government made clear that Hamas's presence in Doha was intolerable. Israeli officials suggested that as long as Hamas leaders could plan, strategize, and fundraise from Qatar's safe haven, any talk of peace was an illusion. To Israel, the war was not only fought in Gaza's ruins, but also in the diplomatic lounges of the Gulf. Behind this confrontation lay a bigger story, the geopolitical weight of Qatar. Despite its small size, the country wields outsized influence. Its immense natural gas wealth, its global media empire anchored by Al Jazeera, and its hosting of the largest US airbase in the region make it indispensable to Washington. Al Udeid Air Base has been central to American operations in the Middle East for decades. To strike in Qatar, therefore, was not only to confront Hamas, but also to send a message to the United States. Israel will act wherever it deems necessary, even if it unsettles its closest allies' partners. For the Biden administration, the development created a diplomatic dilemma. Washington depends on Qatar to mediate, to host Hamas for indirect negotiations, and to provide financial relief to Gaza that prevents total collapse. At the same time, it is Israel's main defender on the world stage, supplying it with weapons, funds, and political backing at the United Nations. Netanyahu's words forced Washington to reckon with a question it had long avoided. Could Qatar truly be both a mediator and a host for Hamas? Regional analysts describe Netanyahu's strategy as both bold and risky. By expanding the battlefield to Doha, Israel broke an unwritten rule of the conflict that Gulf states, despite their ties, were insulated from direct Israeli military pressure. Now that insulation was gone. The risk was that Arab states, already angered by Gaza's devastation, could rally together in unprecedented ways. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, though often rivals, might find common cause in condemning Israeli overreach. At the same time, Netanyahu's domestic calculus cannot be ignored. Facing growing dissent at home, with protests demanding an end to the war and criticism of his leadership mounting, he needed to show strength. By pointing at Qatar, he sought to prove to Israelis that the war's challenges were not the fault of his government alone, that the enemy was not only Hamas in Gaza, but also the regional and international forces giving it shelter. Yet the backlash was real. The strike in Doha triggered debates at the United Nations, where diplomats worried it might set off a dangerous new cycle of retaliation. Human rights groups warned that targeting a sovereign state outside the active war zone marked a profound escalation. And in capitals across the world, the question began to take shape. If Israel could strike Qatar, where else might it strike next? This confrontation has placed Qatar's carefully cultivated image as a mediator in jeopardy. For years, Doha prided itself on being the place where adversaries could sit down, if not face-to-face, then at least indirectly. It was where hostage deals were cut, where ceasefire papers were drafted, where US officials quietly shuttled messages. Netanyahu's attack threatened to dismantle that reputation overnight, replacing it with a new one, that of a state accused of funding and housing militants. The implications stretch far beyond the immediate war. If Qatar is sidelined, who will mediate between Israel and Hamas? Egypt has long played a role, but its relations with Hamas are fraught. Turkey might step in, but its credibility with Israel is limited. Without Qatar, the fragile web of diplomacy holding back total chaos risks tearing apart. For Netanyahu, however, the calculation seems clear. By taking the fight to Doha, he signals that Israel will not allow safe havens, no matter where they are. His words frame the war as global in reach, not confined to Gaza's borders. It is a narrative designed to justify Israel's actions to its domestic audience, to pressure Washington, and to deter other states from offering protection to Hamas leaders. As the dust settles, the world is left with a troubling reality. This is no longer just a war fought in Gaza's alleyways or on its borders with Lebanon. It has become a war that challenges diplomatic norms, reshapes alliances, and tests the limits of regional stability. Netanyahu's words about Qatar mark not only a moment of political theatre, but a potential turning point in Middle Eastern diplomacy. And as the war grinds on, the questions grow sharper. Will Washington continue to rely on Qatar as its mediator of choice? Will Arab states tolerate Israeli strikes beyond traditional fronts? And will Hamas continue to find refuge in the Gulf, even as the costs of hosting it rise? What is clear is that Netanyahu has expanded the battlefield. By accusing Qatar and striking inside its borders, he has transformed the conflict into something far larger. It is no longer just about Gaza. It is about influence, alliances, and the very balance of power in the Middle East. This is not simply another chapter in a long conflict. It is the opening of a new front, one that could redefine diplomacy and redraw the lines of war. The world watches closely because the choices made now in Jerusalem and in Doha will echo far beyond the region, shaping the course of a conflict that refuses to end.